The map showed an airstrip on a wind-blasted island at the northern tip of West Falkland. Pebble Island, or Puerto Calderón, as the Argentine forces now called it, had approximately 25 permanent residents in 1982, most of them sheep farmers whose families had been there for generations. 3 weeks before the night this account concerns, the island had been exactly that, a remote agricultural settlement on a remote sub-Antarctic island, unremarkable on any military map. Then, on April 24, 1982, the Argentine Navy established Estación Aeronaval Calderón on the peat ground beside the settlement and began flying in aircraft. By the 14th of May, the airstrip housed 11 of them. 6 were FMA IA-58 Pucarás, twin-turboprop ground attack aircraft belonging to FAA Grupo 3 de Ataque, the Argentine Air Force's third attack group. 4 more were Beechcraft T-34C Turbo-Mentors, operated by CANA Escuadrilla, the fourth flight of Argentine naval aviation. The 11th was a short SC.7 Skyvan, an Argentine Coast Guard utility transport. In the wider scheme of Argentine air power in 1982, these weren't frontline fast jets. Not the Skyhawks, not the Daggers, not the Super Étendards that had already sunk HMS Sheffield and were continuing to threaten the carrier battle group from mainland bases. By conventional military valuation, Estación Aeronaval Calderón was a secondary installation on a secondary island. The Argentine command assessed it accordingly. The problem was geography. Pebble Island sits at the northern edge of West Falkland, and San Carlos Water, the inlet on East Falkland where the British planned to put the entire amphibious force ashore in 6 days' time, was less than 4 minutes flying time from the Calderón airstrip. 4 minutes for a twin-turboprop ground attack aircraft, carrying bombs, rocket pods and napalm tanks on 3 underwing hardpoints. 4 minutes at low altitude to the beaches where 3 Commando Brigade and 2 Parachute Regiment battalions were scheduled to land in the 3rd week of May. The Pucarás isn't a fast jet and was never designed to be. The FMA IA-58 was designed in Argentina, built in Argentina, and operated by the Argentine Air Force as a purpose-built counterinsurgency platform. Slow, maneuverable at low altitude, capable of operating from short strips in austere conditions, and optimized for the missions that describe most of what happens below 1,000 feet in a ground war. Against landing craft, flat-bottomed supply vessels, and infantry forming up on a beach during an amphibious assault, the Pucarás was exactly the right aircraft in exactly the right position. The British landing plan required San Carlos Water to absorb 2,500 troops and their equipment in the most vulnerable possible tactical situation. Disembarking from ships onto an undefended beach in the hours after dawn, with no established perimeter and no ability to maneuver until the beachhead was secured. The window of maximum vulnerability would last hours. Pebble Island was 4 minutes away. On the night of 14th of May 1982, the men of D Squadron, 22 Special Air Service Regiment, walked out of the South Atlantic darkness and ended that threat. This is how. By the first week of May, Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward, commanding the carrier battle group from HMS Hermes, was managing a campaign that was tighter on every axis than the public understood. He had 2 light carriers, Hermes and Invincible, carrying approximately 20 Sea Harriers between them. Those aircraft provided the task force's only air cover. The pilots were flying at punishing operational tempo, with no diversion, no shore base, and nowhere to go if their aircraft were unrecoverable. The carriers themselves were the centre of gravity of the entire campaign, a fact Woodward explicitly acknowledged in his subsequent memoir, 100 Days, and a fact the Argentine command was using as the organizing principle of its air campaign. The Sheffield sinking had made the calculus visible. On the 4th of May, Super Étendards of CANA 2 Escuadrilla launched an AM-39 Exocet that was aimed at Hermes and hit Sheffield instead. 20 men died. The ship burned for 6 days before sinking. The immediate operational consequence was that bringing either carrier within any exposure window the Argentine air campaign could exploit required a justification that went beyond tactical opportunism. Every additional minute of carrier exposure was a minute that a Super Étendard crew might use to lock a targeting radar. Woodward's decision on Pebble Island required holding that risk against a specific payoff. A conventional airstrike, Sea Harriers or Harrier GR3s making attack runs on the Calderón airstrip, would have kept the carriers within the Exocet threat envelope for longer than an insertion operation required, and it raised a separate problem. Pebble Island's civilian settlement sat close enough to the airstrip that a conventional bombing run against aircraft on the ground couldn't guarantee it avoided the families who lived there. 25 civilian residents, British subjects, who had no part in the conflict. Woodward wasn't prepared to kill them when a surgical alternative existed. Naval bombardment alone couldn't guarantee results. A ship firing at aircraft on the ground in darkness, without ground observers to assess and correct, could damage the strip and potentially destroy some aircraft. But it couldn't confirm that every last Pucarás was neutralized. One serviceable aircraft, surviving a bombardment and flying on 21st May, represented the same risk as 11 had. D Squadron was the alternative. A precisely planned heliborne assault, guided by advance reconnaissance, supported by naval gunfire and timed to fit within the carrier's risk window. The carrier would close, launch, recover, and clear the area within a specific and bounded exposure window. It was a more complicated operation than a strike sortie. It was also a more precise one. Woodward accepted the risk. Operation Prelim was allocated its code name and placed formally as a sub-operation of Operation Sutton, the amphibious landing plan. Authorization ran through Fleet Headquarters at Northwood within the framework of Cabinet authority governing Operation Corporate. The operation was on the planning critical path, not an opportunistic addition, but a prerequisite for the landing. Its execution was set for the 14th of May. San Carlos was the 21st of May. 6 days was the margin. Major Cedric Delves commanded D Squadron, 22 Special Air Service Regiment. He was 35 years old when Argentina invaded on April 2, 1982, and he was, by his own account in Across an Angry Sea, published by Hearst 36 years after the events it describes, working against incomplete information and insufficient planning time from the first day. The fact that D Squadron, rather than G Squadron, was deployed first involves a specific piece of competitive military manoeuvring that Delves recounts with characteristic directness. He essentially talked his unit into the lead slot. The memoir is the primary source for D Squadron's Falklands operations and is used accordingly throughout this account. By the time Prelim was being planned in the first 2 weeks of May, D Squadron had already had an expensive war. The Fortuna Glacier operation in South Georgia, an attempted reconnaissance insertion that resulted in 2 helicopters wrecked in whiteout conditions before the mission even reached its objective, had nearly destroyed the squadron before it had fired a shot in anger. Delves was direct about the command decisions that led to the Glacier attempt and what they cost. He was also clear about what the squadron learned from it. D Squadron arrived at Pebble Island as a unit that had made serious mistakes under combat conditions and had corrected itself accordingly. That is a different kind of experience from training exercises, and it showed in the planning. For prelim, the task allocation within D Squadron followed the troop structure. Mountain Troop would assault the airstrip and destroy the aircraft. That was the primary mission. Boat Troop would insert by sea several days in advance, conduct the reconnaissance and guide the main assault force from the landing zone to the objective on the night of the raid. A protection and fire support element would hold the perimeter, engage the Argentine garrison with GPMG teams, and operate the 81mm mortar group against the garrison positions. An artillery spotter from 148 Mechthiler Commando Forward Observation Battery, the specialist unit responsible for directing naval gunfire in support of Special Forces operations, would accompany the assault force to bring HMS Glamorgan's guns onto specific targets. Captain Timothy Burles commanded the reconnaissance element. Ewan Houston commanded the assault on the airstrip. Warrant Officer Class II Lawrence Gallagher, D Squadron's Squadron Sergeant Major, was present with the force throughout. Gallagher is worth naming now, and not only for what happened at Pebble Island. He was born in Don Valley, Yorkshire, on the 30th of April 1945, served in the Royal Engineers before passing SAS selection, and by 1982 was the most senior non-commissioned officer in D Squadron. The SSM of an SAS squadron in combat isn't a ceremonial appointment. Delves commanded. Gallagher made the unit work. Operational welfare, discipline, fighting effectiveness, the institutional knowledge that keeps a complex military organisation functional under the pressure of a sustained campaign. He held the British Empire Medal. Those who served with him describe a big man with a physical authority that matched his professional one. He survived Pebble Island. His fate comes later in this account. The force size that Delves records in Across an Angry Sea is 45 men. Other accounts give 42 or 48. The Delves figure is used here. The operation also involved the Special Boat Service. Delves's memoir explicitly references working alongside the SBS during the campaign, and the operational record confirms a concurrent diversionary element timed to coincide with the D Squadron assault on the airstrip. The precise composition and method of the SBS element isn't fully documented in the open record, and popular accounts frequently either omit it entirely or invent detail to fill the gap. Both errors go in the wrong direction. What is accurate is that Operation Prelim was a joint Special Forces package, not a solo SAS operation, and the SBS diversionary element was a designed component of its structure. Leaving it out of any account of the night is the single most common error in popular retellings of Pebble Island. The targeting decision reflected an intelligence update received in the planning period. An earlier version of the plan had included Argentine garrison personnel as assault targets alongside the aircraft. By the time Prelim was finalised, the scope had been narrowed. Aircraft destruction was the primary objective, and the garrison was to be suppressed and contained rather than specifically assaulted. The mortar fire and naval gunfire would keep the Argentine Marines away from the airstrip, while Mountain Troop worked the flight line. That was the plan as it went forward. Before the main force left HMS Hermes, there had to be eyes on the objective. Around the night of 10th May, a boat troop reconnaissance party inserted onto Pebble Island by Klepper Canoe, the two-man collapsible canvas canoes that are boat troops' standard cold water insertion equipment. They paddled in from seaward in darkness, came ashore on the island's exposed coastline, and moved inland toward the airstrip. The Falklands night in mid-May provides working cover for movement, but it does not provide warmth. The temperature on Pebble Island in that period was near freezing, with the prevailing westerlies driving the effective temperature lower. The reconnaissance party crossed open peat ground from the shoreline toward the airstrip, navigating without artificial light across terrain that offers almost no reference features in darkness. They found a hide position in the peat and dug in. The standard SAS observation post technique uses the terrain itself for concealment. Falklands peat is deep and cut by natural drainage channels. Hags, the local name for the collapsed edges of old peat workings, that create natural concealment running along the ground. A position properly cut into a peat hag, with the excavated material redistributed and the surface dressed back, looks like more moorland. The reconnaissance party disappeared into the ground 4 days before the main force arrived. 4 days in a peat hide on Pebble Island in mid-May. No fire, no hot food, no movement during daylight hours, cold rations eaten cold, water from whatever came off the ground. Radio communication windows to transmit intelligence back to HMS Hermes, timed and brief enough to avoid detection. Everything the assault force would need to operate in darkness on unfamiliar ground, assembled and transmitted from a hole in the peat. The positions of each of the 11 aircraft, the layout of the Argentine garrison, the patrol patterns and timing, the positions of any obstacles or defensive measures between the landing zone and the airstrip, the route from Phillips Cove to the flight line, every terrain feature of it. When the Sea Kings landed at Phillips Cove just before midnight on the 14th of May, the reconnaissance party was at the landing zone. The link-up was immediate. The guides knew every metre of the ground between the coast and the airstrip, because they had crossed it and watched it and transmitted it for 4 days. This is what makes the outcome of Pebble Island something other than a bold improvisation. The precision of the assault: 45 men, 11 aircraft destroyed, 2 wounded, rests on 4 days of prior work by men lying in freezing peat, who are in no account of the operation, given credit proportionate to what they did. The assault group walked to the objective, knowing exactly where each aircraft was parked, because men had been watching those aircraft since May 10th. That advance intelligence was the load-bearing element of the entire operation. Without it, the assault was a gamble in the dark. With it, it was a directed strike against a confirmed, located and quantified set of targets. HMS Hermes left the carrier battle group in the afternoon of the 14th of May, moving north toward Pebble Island with HMS Broadsword as escort. HMS Glamorgan separated to take up her fire support position to the west, calculating her approach to bring her 4.5-inch guns within effective range of the airstrip and its facilities. The ships operated under emissions control, minimizing radar and radio transmissions to avoid alerting the Argentine tracking network to their movement toward the north end of West Falkland. 846 Naval Air Squadron crews briefed their routes and altitudes. 4 Sea King HC-4 helicopters would carry the assault force from Hermes to Phillips Cove, flying at low level in darkness over open water, navigating to a small, unlighted island without electronic approach aids, and doing so within a timetable that admitted no variation. The Sea King pilots who flew these insertions throughout the Falklands campaign received a fraction of the operational attention given to the ground forces they inserted and recovered. In 1982, the task force had very few sets of night vision equipment. These crews flew in natural darkness over featureless ocean, navigating on instruments and horizon line, finding islands that no civilian air traffic system was lighting for them. The helicopters lifted from Hermes and transited to Pebble Island. The assault force was aboard. 45 men in DPM smock jackets, carrying L1A1 SLR self-loading rifles, GPMG teams with their guns and link ammunition, the mortar group with 81mm tubes broken down and distributed among the load carriers, the demolition teams with their frame charges and secondary ordnance, the 148 battery FOB team with communications equipment and laser designator. No plate armour, no modern assault rifles. The SA-80 wasn't yet in service in 1982. No Molly, no Osprey body armour. This was the British Army's actual equipment. Webbing and Bergens loaded well past 50 pounds. DMS boots. The kit that the unit had been issued, rather than the kit that the post-Iraq popular imagination retrospectively dresses SAS operators in. The men who took Pebble Island look, in the photographs taken after the Argentine surrender in June 1982, like British soldiers of 1982. Because that is what they were. 4 Sea Kings put down at Phillips Cove at approximately 23:45 on the 14th of May. The landing zone was a stretch of coastline on the southern side of the island, approximately 3.7 miles, 6 kilometres, from the airstrip. The boat troop reconnaissance party was there. Phillips Cove to the Calderón airstrip is 6 kilometres of featureless peat moorland. No paths, no landmarks visible in darkness, no firm footing. Falklands peat absorbs every step, varying without warning between solid crust and subsiding bog, channeled by drainage ditches invisible until you are standing in them. Movement at night across this ground in full fighting order is measured in hours, not minutes. The assault force had the reconnaissance team's complete knowledge of the route, but knowledge of ground and the physical reality of crossing it are different things. The Bergens were heavy, the cold was persistent, and the timetable was fixed. Hermes couldn't wait. The extraction deadline was before first light, and it wasn't negotiable. The reconnaissance team guided the main force. The column moved. D Squadron reached the airstrip in position. The Argentine garrison at Estación Aeronaval Calderón numbered approximately 150 Marines and aviation personnel. The Pucarás pilots of Grupo 3 de Ataque were in their billets. The aircraft stood on the strip in the precise positions that the reconnaissance team had mapped and transmitted over 4 days of observation. Mountain Troop moved onto the airstrip. The assault's opening measure was HMS Glamorgan. The fire support plan had the ship engaging from seaward before the ground assault began, her 4.5-inch gun targeting the western edge of the runway, the ammunition storage areas, and the fuel facility. Naval artillery fire, arriving without warning at a temporary airfield in darkness, has specific effects beyond the purely physical. For the Argentine garrison in their billets, the eruption of naval gunfire was the first signal that the night had changed. And it changed it in a way that offered no coherent defensive response. The garrison was receiving fire from a ship they couldn't see, in conditions that gave them no bearing on the attacking ground force's location. Simultaneously, the mortar group opened up on the garrison positions. The 81mm mortar fires a high-explosive bomb at rates up to 20 rounds per minute. At the ranges involved on Pebble Island, the mortar group could lay sustained suppressive fire on the billets and approaches to the airstrip without the aircraft being at risk. The mortar group's objective was suppression, keeping the Argentine Marines in their shelters and off the airstrip, while Mountain Troop worked the flight line. Ewan Houston led the assault. Frame charges are prepared demolition devices shaped to attach to specific structural points on an aircraft's airframe. The placement isn't random. On the wing root, the engine nacelle, the tail section, the fuel system. The technique requires physical access to the aircraft in darkness, under time pressure, with a garrison 200 metres away receiving simultaneous mortar fire and naval gunfire and GPMG fire on the approaches. Mountain Troop moved down the flight line, aircraft to aircraft. 7 of the 11 had charges placed on them and were initiated in sequence. The remaining 4 were destroyed with small arms, rockets and hand grenades. Secondary weapons brought specifically for aircraft where charges couldn't be placed in the available time, or where additional destruction was needed to ensure nothing was left operational. The GPMG teams held the perimeter throughout. The L7A2 GPMG fires 7.62mm link at 750 rounds per minute and engages targets out to 1,800 metres. A pair of GPMG teams on the approaches to an airstrip under assault creates a beaten zone that makes movement toward it extremely costly. The Argentine garrison, hit simultaneously by naval artillery, mortar bombs and GPMG fire on every approach, stayed in their shelters. The raid's accounts describe no coherent Argentine counter-movement onto the airstrip during the destruction phase. The time from first detonation to last charge was approximately 20 to 30 minutes. In that window, the 6 Pucarás of Grupo 3 destroyed, the 4 T-34C Turbo-Mentors of CANA 4 Escuadrilla destroyed, the Skyvan destroyed, the fuel stores burning, the ammunition dump producing secondary detonations as Glamorgan's shells cooked off the stored ordnance. 11 aircraft. That count appears in Delves's memoir, is confirmed across multiple independent sources, and is the British figure. The Argentine counter-argument holds that some aircraft were already unserviceable and shouldn't be counted among the raid's destruction, reducing the effective figure to around 7. The debate is in the historical record. What isn't in debate is that none of the 11 aircraft subsequently flew. 1 Argentine fatality. An officer came out of a building during the assault and was killed by small arms fire. His identity hasn't been confirmed across the multiple independent sources required to name him with confidence, and it isn't named here. The navalhistory.net operational account of the week's events records the moment plainly. A brief Argentine counterattack was halted when the officer in charge was shot. The garrison then remained in place. The assault group withdrew. On the withdrawal route toward Phillips Cove, an Argentine remote-controlled mine detonated. 1 soldier took shrapnel. 1 sustained concussion from the blast. Both injuries were serious, but not incapacitating. Both men were at the landing zone when the Sea Kings arrived. The force loaded. The helicopters lifted. HMS Hermes recovered her aircraft before dawn. Operation Prelim, approximately 30 minutes of active assault, 11 aircraft destroyed, 2 British soldiers wounded, 1 Argentine officer killed. The carrier battle group's exposure window within its planned parameters. The Pucarás threat to the San Carlos landing removed 6 days before the San Carlos landing. To understand what happened to the Argentine forces at Estación Aeronaval Calderón, the standard popular framing needs to be discarded first. The standard framing treats the Pebble Island garrison as a negligent or incompetent force caught sleeping by an alert enemy. That framing is wrong in every specific. The Pucarás pilots of FAA Grupo 3 de Ataque were professional military aviators, flying a purpose-built Argentine combat aircraft in a campaign they had been pressing since May 1st. On May 28, 1982, 2 weeks after Pebble Island, a Pucarás of Grupo 3 shot down a British Army Westland Scout helicopter near Darwin. An air combat kill against an armed military aircraft pressed in combat conditions. The pilot who achieved it was doing what trained ground attack pilots do when the opportunity exists. The Pucarás community in the Argentine Air Force wasn't an outfit that didn't know what it was doing. The Argentine Air Force's performance across the entire campaign sustained that conclusion under sustained pressure. The Skyhawk pilots of Grupos 4, 5 and 6 flew to the Falklands at the absolute limits of their fuel range, sometimes beyond the range that guaranteed a return flight, pressed bomb runs through Seawolf and Sea Dart envelopes, through GPMG fire from ships and Sidewinder-armed Sea Harriers overhead, through anti-aircraft guns on deck and shore, and achieved genuine campaign results. HMS Ardent, HMS Antelope, HMS Coventry, Atlantic Conveyor, serious ships and serious men, taken out by an air force flying aircraft a generation old at the extreme limit of their operational reach, because the pilots pressed through defences that were designed to stop them, and sometimes didn't. These weren't the operations of a military that couldn't perform under pressure. The Pucarás pilots at Calderón were stood down on the night of 14th of May by a combination of weather and the assessment of their command that a heli-borne Special Forces assault on a garrisoned outlying island wasn't a credible British option. That assessment was grounded in rational analysis. Woodward had already demonstrated throughout the campaign that he treated the carriers as the task force's irreplaceable centre of gravity and managed their exposure accordingly. Bringing HMS Hermes inside helicopter insertion range of a coast under Argentine radar observation required accepting the kind of carrier exposure that had already cost Sheffield and continued to threaten the battle group daily. Argentine Command calculated that Woodward wouldn't accept that risk to neutralise a secondary airfield. The calculation was professionally defensible. It was wrong in one specific and decisive respect. It didn't account for what 45 men could do once they were on the ground. And it didn't account for the tightly bounded exposure window that made the risk acceptable. There was also a structural factor. Argentina's military in 1982 had no Joint Special Operations Command. A subsequent Argentine military analysis identified this explicitly as an institutional failure exposed by the campaign, not a criticism of the individual officers who served, but a doctrinal gap. When you lack a capability, you don't model the threat that capability poses. The Argentine Command modelled the threats it understood. The threat it didn't understand arrived at Phillips Cove at 23:45 on the 14th of May. The Argentine Naval Command ordered the evacuation of Calderón's personnel in late May. The station established on the 24th of April was abandoned by the 1st of June. The 38-day operational existence of Estación Aeronaval Calderón ended with its aircraft on the ground and its garrison intact, but its function destroyed. HMS Hermes recovered her Sea Kings and cleared her exposure window before first light on May 15th. The carrier battle group reformed. Woodward received confirmation of the raid's results. All 11 aircraft destroyed, fuel stores and ammunition neutralised, the airstrip non-operational. The air threat to the San Carlos landing from Pebble Island specifically had been removed. 6 days remained before the landing. On 21st of May 1982, 3 Commando Brigade, 2 Para and 3 Para began landing at San Carlos Water in the hours before dawn. The Argentine Air Force struck the amphibious force that day and on subsequent days with everything it had. Skyhawks of Grupo 5 attacked on 21st May itself. HMS Ardent was hit by multiple bombs and sank the following day. HMS Antelope on 23rd to 24th May, a bomb detonating during disposal.
HMS Coventry on the 25th of May, 19 men killed.
That same afternoon, 2 Super Étendards of CANA 2 Escuadrilla fired their last operational exocet into the container ship Atlantic Conveyor, killing 12 and destroying 4 transport helicopters the force had been depending on to move troops across the Falklands. Bomb Alley wasn't a metaphor. It was what happened when an air force flying at the limit of its range, attacking through one of the densest air defence packages the Royal Navy had ever assembled, still got through often enough to sink ships and kill sailors. None of those aircraft had flown from Pebble Island. The Pucarás, that had been positioned 4 minutes from the San Carlos beaches, the low-level ground attack aircraft optimised for exactly the kind of close support strike that an amphibious landing's most vulnerable hours invite, were destroyed. Not suppressed, not interdicted, not temporarily degraded.
Destroyed 6 days in advance by 45 men walking 6 kilometres of peat in darkness. The ground attack threat from Calderón specifically was absent from May 21st, from May 25th, from every day of the land campaign that followed. Goose Green still had Pucarás operating from it, and they flew ground attack missions later in the campaign. But the concentrated, close position threat from the nearest Argentine airfield to the landing beaches had been removed with precision. The distinction requires care. Pebble Island didn't end Argentine air attacks on the San Carlos landing. The Royal Navy paid for those beaches, with ships and with lives, and that payment was real, and the losses were real, and they aren't diminished by anything D Squadron did on the 14th of May. What the raid removed was one specific component of the air threat. The component geographically closest to the beaches, best suited by design to beach attack missions, and most likely to have compounded the already severe attacks from the mainland if it had been available on May 21st. Whether 6 operational Pucarás added to the air effort on that day would have changed the outcome is a question the record can't settle. What it does settle is that they weren't there. Lawrence Gallagher was born in Don Valley, Yorkshire, on the 30th of April 1945. He joined the Army through the Royal Engineers, passed SAS selection, was posted to D Squadron, and by 1982 was Warrant Officer Class 2, the Squadron Sergeant Major. He held the British Empire Medal. He was, by the accounts of those who served with him, physically imposing and professionally authoritative in the specific way that the most competent man in a room full of competent men tends to be. The SSM of an SAS squadron in a sustained combat campaign isn't a ceremonial role. Delves commanded the mission. Gallagher made the unit work. Welfare, operational effectiveness, institutional discipline, the accumulated knowledge that keeps 45 men functioning at operational level when everything is moving at speed and the margins for error are narrow. He was on Pebble Island on the night of the 14th of May. He walked off that airstrip with the force, was recovered to Phillips Cove, and was on HMS Hermes before dawn on the 15th. On the 19th of May 1982, 4 days after the raid, a Sea King HC-4 of 846 Naval Air Squadron was cross-decking D Squadron personnel between ships when it crashed into the sea. The circumstances of the crash involved a bird strike and catastrophic engine failure. Gallagher was aboard. He died in the water. He was 37 years old. He had been born on the 30 April 1945, which meant he had turned 37 14 days before the night at Calderón, and died 5 days after it. The losses in that crash were severe enough to change D Squadron's operational composition for the remainder of the campaign. B Squadron, 22 SAS, was flown south to reinforce the unit. D Squadron continued, the Darwin/Goose Green diversionary feint that tied down Argentine forces during the San Carlos landing. The coup de main at Mount Kent that put SAS troops on commanding ground overlooking Port Stanley before the Argentine command had reoriented to the amphibious threat. They did all of that without the men who went into the sea on May 19th. The clean arithmetic of the Pebble Island raid, 11 aircraft, 2 wounded, no British killed, is accurate for that night. The campaign cost is a different figure. D Squadron lost approximately a third of its fighting strength before the Falklands campaign ended, most of it in that one crash, 4 days after its most precisely executed operation. Separating Pebble Island from the Sea King crash, filing one under success and the other under tragedy, as if they are unconnected, misrepresents what the men of D Squadron experienced and what the Falklands cost them. From the night of 14th May 1982 to the killing of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad on 2nd May 2011 is 29 years. The operational architecture is recognisably continuous. Advance reconnaissance on the ground days before the main assault, conducted by a small team rather than from remote sensors. Precise ground-level intelligence about aircraft positions, garrison disposition, approach routes and obstacle locations. A hard extraction deadline built around the vulnerability of the platform that delivered the force. Multi-element coordination. Assault group, fire support, concurrent diversionary operation, all timed against the same clock. A force sized to achieve the defined objective rather than to overwhelm the defending garrison. No conventional air cover. A timetable with no flexibility. The carrier closes, the force goes in, the force comes out, the carrier clears the area. No second chance if the timing fails. The direct doctrinal lineage can't be traced in declassified documents. What can be observed is that every operational principle present at Pebble Island remained present in every significant Western direct action raid of the following 4 decades. Operation Barras in Sierra Leone in September 2000. 11 hostages recovered from the West Side Boys in an operation lasting under 2 hours. 1 British fatality, 75 rebels killed. The direct action architecture of the Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns from 2001 onwards. The Abbottabad raid in 2011, flown from a forward operating base at extreme helicopter range, timed around a specific window, extracted before the Pakistani military had developed a picture of what was happening. The force-to-objective ratio, the intelligence preparation, the extraction deadline as a non-negotiable constraint, the willingness to accept bounded carrier or basing platform exposure if the payoff is specific and confirmed enough. Pebble Island didn't invent these principles. What it did was prove them at campaign scale, against a real military opponent, under operational pressure, in conditions that should have made it extremely difficult. The proof was clean. Clean enough that the men who provided it still find it uncomfortable to discuss 40 years later. Because a clean proof implies that it was easier than it looked.
And operations that look that easy from the outside tend to look that way because of the 4 days lying in the peat that nobody photographs. The veterans of D Squadron who were on Pebble Island on the night of 14th of May 1982 are, in 2026, in their late 60s, 70s and 80s. Major Delves, 35 in April 1982, 79 now, published his account of the campaign 36 years after it ended. The men who placed frame charges on Argentine Pucarás in the darkness of the Calderón airstrip have watched 40 years of popular retellings. The wrong names, the wrong ranks, the SBS left out of the account entirely or invented in detail beyond what the record supports. The aircraft count disputed or inflated. The Argentine garrison reduced from professional military personnel doing their jobs within the constraints of a command miscalculation into a cartoon of sleeping incompetence. The whole operation turned into a thriller rather than an account of what actually happened on a specific night to specific people with specific results. The operation was this: a boat troop reconnaissance party ashore around 10th May, spending 4 days in the peat watching and mapping the objective. 4 Sea King HC-4 helicopters of 846 NAS putting down.